Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Horror Chronicles. Before we start, I would like to know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. Also, if these stories help you to sleep, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to the channel. Now make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's get started. The sun was warm on my back as I leaned against the fence, watching the pigs snort and shuffle around their feed. The morning chores were done and the farm stretched quiet and still around me, just the way I liked it. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh hay and wildflowers, mixing with the earthy smell of the pig pen. That's when I saw it. A kite? It was the kind of thing you didn't expect to see out here. Bright red, with long, tattered white tails that fluttered lazily in the wind. It drifted above the forest at the edge of the property, its movements almost hypnotic. I tilted my head, squinting against the sun. Who on earth would be flying a kite way out here? I couldn't stop watching it. The kite dipped and twisted in the breeze, its tails catching the sunlight like ribbons of fire. There was something graceful about it, something deliberate. Whoever was flying it knew exactly what they were doing. The thought surged through my mind. I rested my arms on the fence, my mind racing. Nobody ever came out this way. At least, not that I'd seen. Our farm was surrounded by miles of empty fields, with the forest standing like a wall on the horizon. It wasn't the kind of place where you just stumbled across another person. But there it was. The kite swirled again, its string disappearing into the dense canopy of trees. I squinted, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was holding it, but the forest was too thick. Just shadows and shifting leaves. Strange, I muttered, more to myself than anyone. The breeze picked up, tugging at my hair, and the kite danced higher. I found myself leaning forward, trying to imagine who might be on the other end of the string. A kid, maybe? But the nearest neighbors were miles away, and they didn't have kids. None of it made sense. Then a proper crime starts. I glanced back at the house, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. Mom would probably laugh if I told her about the kite. Dad would just tell me to get back to work. Still, I couldn't help myself. I shifted my weight, my hands tightening on the rough wood of the fence. The kite hovered, teasing me like it knew I wanted to follow. The breeze tugged at my hair again, almost playful, and I let out a small laugh under my breath. One quick look wouldn't hurt. Swinging a leg over the fence, I felt the familiar scrape of the wood against my jeans. My boots hit the ground on the other side with a soft thud, and I brushed my hands off, already taking a step toward the forest. Ellie. I froze, my heart skipping. Ellie, where are you? Mom's voice carried from the house, sharp and insistent. I turned, spotting her standing on the back porch, one hand shading her eyes as she scanned the yard. Coming, I called back, my voice tinged with reluctance. I glanced over my shoulder at the kite, still floating high above the trees, its tails trailing lazily in the breeze. It wasn't going anywhere. I slipped back into the house, the faint scent of soap and cleaning supplies greeting me as I stepped inside. Mom was already at the sink, scrubbing away at a pot. Good, you're here. Mop the floors while I finish in here, will you? She said, not even looking up. I nodded, my mind still wandering back to the kite and the way it had danced so freely in the air. I grabbed the mop, pushing it in slow, repetitive circles across the kitchen floor, trying to keep my thoughts focused. I wondered, what could it have been? A person? Sure. But who would be flying a kite out in the middle of nowhere? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The rest of the parties. I pushed the mop harder, angry at myself for not having gone to look earlier, for letting my mom call me inside when I was so close. Have you... Ellie, Mom said, snapping me out of my thoughts. Get the dishes too, after you finish the floor. I sighed, grabbing the dish soap from the counter. By the time I was done with everything, sweeping, mopping, and cleaning up the kitchen, it was almost lunchtime. "All right," I muttered, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "I'm going back out there." The sun was higher in the sky when I finally stepped outside, the air warm and heavy. The farm still stretched out around me, quiet and endless, but something felt off. I glanced up, hoping to see that kite again, but the sky was empty, the breeze too still to carry anything. My chest tightened, the curiosity from earlier creeping back. "Oh," I bit my lip, staring out toward the edge of the forest where the kite had been flying. The thought of it, gone so suddenly, left me restless. I knew what I had to do. I made my way across the field again, toward the trees, but this time I didn't stop at the fence. I kept walking, my boots crunching softly in the dry grass, the forest getting closer. Followed the line where I had seen the kite dipping lower and lower. Something had been in the woods, something I hadn't seen before. And sure enough, as I passed into the trees, I noticed a break in the underbrush. I pushed through the branches, heart racing as I followed the path. Then, just as I thought I might be imagining things, I stepped into a small clearing, and there it was. And finally, I found the shack. It was old, run down, and almost hidden by the thick trees that surrounded it. The wood was chipped and faded, the roof sagging with age. I hadn't seen it before, at least not up close, and now that I was standing here, I realized I'd never even noticed it in the distance. The muzzle of the gun flashed past my face, becoming completely blend. How had I missed it? I took a cautious step forward, a wave of unease washing over me. There was no sign of life, no obvious footprints, but the air felt thicker here. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in slow, steady bursts. The air felt heavier in the clearing, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. 1:30 had already passed, and the sun was touching its lower rising line. I could turn back. I could go back to the farm, forget about it, but no. Something inside me stirred. This was too strange to ignore. I stepped forward, my boots crunching softly against the dry ground. Each step felt like a betrayal of everything my parents had told me about staying away from the forest, but I didn't care. I had to know. I reached the shack and pushed open the door with a groan of rusted hinges. It was darker inside than I expected, the light filtering in through gaps in the rotting wood. The air smelled like mildew and decay, but there was something else too, something faintly sweet, like forgotten memories. I hesitated, my hand hovering near the doorframe as I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight, and I winced at the noise, hoping it wouldn't draw attention. The place was eerily still. Dust and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. A small window on the far side of the room let in a sliver of sunlight, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. A faint breeze soothed, and then I saw it. Leaning up against an old, rotting wooden table was the kite. It was the same one I had seen earlier, bright red, its white tails fluttering slightly, even though there was no wind inside the shack. The string was neatly wrapped around a spool, resting on the table, as if whoever had flown it had just stepped away for a moment. I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something off about it. Who would leave a kite here, like this? It didn't make sense. It felt wrong, like the kite didn't belong in this place. Later, I took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking louder now, and my heart thudded harder in my chest. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the kite. The fabric was surprisingly soft, and the tail rustled faintly at my touch. I recoiled slightly, my skin prickling as the quiet of the shack seemed to settle around me, even thicker than before. I stood there for a moment, my fingers still resting on the soft fabric of the kite. The room was silent, but something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched by invisible eyes. But the kite, it was so bright, so vibrant against the dull, decaying surroundings. I stood and left my surroundings, not looking back. I could take it. A wave of desire washed over me. Who would even notice? It wasn't like anyone else would come out here to see it, let alone take it. The thought of leaving it behind felt almost ridiculous. It was a perfect kite. I glanced around the shack again, as if expecting to find someone watching me from the corners of the room, but the place remained empty. Still. The air was heavy with silence. I looked back at the kite, my hand tightening around the string. It wouldn't hurt to take it, would it? My heart pounded a little faster as I carefully untangled the string from the spool, making sure not to damage it. The kite fit easily into my arms, the edges soft and smooth under my fingertips. I didn't think about what I was doing, or the fact that I was probably doing something wrong. All I cared about was how it felt to hold something so perfect. I made my way back toward the farm, the kite still in my arms. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no sign of anyone. No one had followed me. No one had even been there. The feeling that I had just stolen something precious gnawed at the back of my mind, but I ignored it. Seconds later, "This kite was mine now," Walter asked as he gripped the kite withering. When I got back to the farm, it was like the world had shifted just a little. The kite felt like a part of me now, an extension of my hands as I ran through the fields with it trailing behind me like a banner. The wind was perfect. I let it soar, feeling the power of it, watching it catch the breeze and glide like something alive. It wasn't just any kite. It was special. The way it dipped and climbed, twirling on the wind, as if it were designed to cut through the sky like an eagle on the hunt. I frowned as I watched it hatch from lever to lever. Popping the sword into my hands, I lowered it to the ground. I ran circles around the yard, the kite pulling me along, its long fluttering tails dancing behind it. I was on top of the world. But then I heard Dad's voice from the porch. "Ellie." I froze. He was leaning against the door frame, his arms crossed, eyes narrowing at the kite in my hands. "Where'd you get that?" I hesitated, the joy in my chest turning to a nervous lump. I found it, out by the woods." His brow furrowed. "The woods?" He stepped down the porch steps, walking toward me, his eyes still fixed on the kite. "Eh," I said, my voice shaky now. "I saw it, in the forest. It was just there. It's amazing, right? It flies so well." He stopped a few feet away, his gaze hardening. "Put it back," he said, his voice low and steady. "Now," she answered, "because there can be no life without the darkness." I opened my mouth to argue, to explain how perfect the kite was, how it felt like it was meant for me, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was the same look he gave when he meant business. "All right," I muttered, feeling the weight of his words settle on me like a stone. Cheryl nodded. I turned and walked back toward the trees, the kite still clutched in my hands. As I entered the woods, I noticed the air had grown colder, a stiff breeze biting at my skin. The trees seemed to close in on me, casting long shadows across the path. When I reached the spot where I'd found the kite, my breath caught in my throat. It was gone. The clearing was empty, the ground undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. No shack, no broken-down table, no kite. I glanced around once more, but all I saw was the same empty space. I turned in circles, scanning the forest like I might find some clue, some trace that it had all been real. but there was nothing. No shack. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What the hell was going on? I knew I was supposed to go back home empty-handed. That's what Dad would expect. He'd told me to return it, and part of me knew I should leave it here, just drop it and go back, pretend nothing happened. But I couldn't. The kite was too perfect, too beautiful. I couldn't just leave it here. I couldn't explain why, but the way it flew, the way it felt in my hands, it was different. I bit my lip, standing there for a long moment, torn between what I knew I should do and the desire to keep it for myself. It was too pretty. It flew too well. I couldn't just give it up. So I made a decision. I slipped into the barn, the familiar smell of hay and old wood filling my nose. The barn was empty, quiet. I pushed aside a stack of hay bales, the loose strands of straw brushing against my fingers. Then I tucked the kite into the shadows, carefully wrapping the string around its spool and hiding it beneath the bales. It was the perfect hiding spot. No one would find it. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk back to the house, empty-handed. I kept my head down, trying to ignore the feeling of the kite still lingering in my hands, even though it was hidden away. When I walked inside, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning me as I entered. "Well?" he asked, his tone flat. I looked up at him, my throat tightening. "I put it back," I said, trying to sound convincing. Why was he bothering her? He raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I'm sure." He didn't look convinced. His gaze hardened, and he pushed himself up from the table, walking over to me. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, but he didn't press me further. Still, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air, making me feel like I was doing something wrong. Like I couldn't quite understand what I was dealing with. I just wanted to get away from him, away from the farm, away from the fear that was slowly crawling up my spine. I hated this place. I hated the walls and the furniture and the rats. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I quietly walked past him, heading to my room to try to forget the kite. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. I slipped into bed, hoping to forget the day, the weirdness of the shack, the strange emptiness where it had been, the way my dad had looked at me. The covers were warm, but my mind wouldn't settle. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, my body restless under the weight of what I'd done. At first, everything was fine. I was out in the yard, but it wasn't like it was during the day. The light had a softness to it, like the sun was setting just below the horizon, casting everything in a warm golden glow. The air smelled like summer, fresh and sweet, and everything felt peaceful. Then, without thinking, I lifted off the ground. It wasn't like I was flying high, but I was hovering, floating, just a few feet above the grass. The wind tugged at my clothes, and I felt light, like a balloon lifted by the breeze. It felt amazing at first, weightless, free. I zoomed around, gliding over the field, feeling the wind rush past my face. It was like I was a part of the air itself, just drifting along without any effort. But soon, the freedom started to slip away. I tried to turn, to go in a different direction, but I couldn't. My arms were stiff, stretched wide, frozen in place. The wind wasn't letting me move how I wanted. I tried to push myself forward, but instead, I felt myself pulled in a direction I didn't choose. Better things and spending my time exercising. I just wanted to get away from him, away from the farm, away from the fear that was slowly crawling up my spine. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I quietly walked past him, heading to my room to try to forget the kite. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. I slipped into bed, hoping to forget the day, the weirdness of the shack, the strange emptiness where it had been, the way my dad had looked at me. The covers were warm, but my mind wouldn't settle. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, my body restless under the weight of what I'd done. At first, everything was fine. I was out in the yard, but it wasn't like it was during the day. The light had a softness to it, like the sun was setting just below the horizon, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. The air smelled like summer, fresh and sweet, and everything felt peaceful. Then, without thinking, I lifted off the ground. It wasn't like I was flying high, but I was hovering, floating, just a few feet above the grass. The wind tugged at my clothes, and I felt light, like a balloon lifted by the breeze. My arms stretched out, and I could feel the wind guiding me, carrying me across the yard. It felt amazing at first, weightless, free. I zoomed around, gliding over the field, feeling the wind rush past my face. It was like I was a part of the air itself, just drifting along without any effort. But soon, the freedom started to slip away. I tried to turn, to go in a different direction, but I couldn't. My arms were stiff, stretched wide, frozen in place. The wind wasn't letting me move how I wanted. I tried to push myself forward, but instead, I felt myself pulled in a direction I didn't choose. That's when I noticed it, the strength. It wrapped around my arms, tight and unyielding, pulling me. I wasn't flying. I was being flown. My limbs were stuck, unable to break free from the invisible hand that controlled the wind. I looked down, panic setting in. There, on the ground beneath me, I saw the figure. A man, standing just beyond the fence, wearing a straw hat. He was holding the string. My heart skipped. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't move. I was a puppet, dangling in the air, my body tied to his will. And then, everything went black. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. The room was cold, and I was drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, and the remnants of the dream clung to me like a heavy fog. I glanced at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My breath still ragged. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the chill of the night creeping into my bones. My mind raced, trying to process the nightmare. I didn't have a focus like I'd had before. I turned over in bed, curling into a ball, hoping sleep would finally take me. The morning came too soon. I didn't feel rested, but the day didn't care. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, pushing away the darkness of the night. But the unease lingered, like a cold hand wrapped around my chest. I forced myself out of bed, rubbing my eyes and trying to shake the remnants of the nightmare away. It was just a bad dream. Just a bad dream. Nothing more. Still startled, I listened to Evelyn's whipping. I headed to the kitchen. The scent of fresh hay and the sounds of the farm quickly filled my senses as I went through the motions of the morning chores. The pigs grunted, eager for their breakfast, and the chickens flapped around their coop. But even as I filled the buckets and checked on the livestock, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the same tension I'd felt last night. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see something in the distance, but there was nothing. Just the wide open fields stretching endlessly, the fence posts, the barn, and the forest at the edge of the property, its trees looming like silent sentinels. By the time I finished the last of the chores, my mind was still on edge. I tried to focus, trying to remind myself that it was just nerves, nothing more. I was imagining things. Everything was fine. But then I saw it. Shadow. Moving between the trees, emerging from the brush. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe the wind causing the branches to sway. But as I watched, the figure became clearer, a silhouette, tall and unmoving, standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person. And the straw hat. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. There was something about the way it stood, so still and silent, like it didn't belong. Like it was waiting. I swallowed, my throat dry, and took a cautious step forward. But the moment I moved, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees, like it had never been there at all. Exercise. The feeling of being watched lingered long after the shadow in the woods disappeared. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing so still, so unnervingly calm in the trees. It felt wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. I walked back to the barn, trying to steady my breathing, but the unease gnawed at me. My mind kept returning to the kite, its impossible perfection, the way it flew as if it had a life of its own. I thought about the way it soared, so effortlessly, and how it had felt in my hands, like something ancient and not quite meant for me. The thought of it made my stomach turn. I had to get rid of it. I had to destroy it. I found myself heading toward the barn, not even fully aware of the decision until my hands were already reaching for the hidden kite. My fingers trembled as I pulled it from the hay, the fabric cool and smooth beneath my touch. I could hear the faint sound of the wind picking up outside, and for a moment, it almost seemed like the kite was calling to me. But I couldn't let it. I grabbed a match from the kitchen, my hands shaking as I struck it against the side of the box. The flame caught quickly, and I held it carefully, walking back to the barn. The kite, still beautiful and perfect in my hands, was about to meet its end. I set the kite down in the dirt, the fabric crackling softly as the match touched the edge. It caught fire instantly, the orange and red flames licking at the edges. But as the fire began to spread, something strange happened. The smell. It wasn't the normal scent of burning fabric, wood, or paper. It was something foul. Something sharp and acrid, like burning hair. The stench hit my nose with an intensity that made my eyes water. My stomach churned and I stepped back, unable to stop the retching that rose in my throat. What was that? The flames seemed to twist and writhe, as if the kite itself was alive, fighting against the fire. I could feel it, a presence, pushing back, refusing to be destroyed. But it burned nonetheless, the strange stench growing stronger, almost suffocating in the air. The fire didn't burn like it should, flickering unnaturally, as though something inside the kite was resisting, holding on to life. And then, just like that, it was over. The fire burned itself out, leaving behind only the remains of the kite, blackened and curled. The smell still hung in the air, thick and lingering, as if it had seeped into the very walls of the barn. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the ashes, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to go inside. Reluctantly, I turned toward the house, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to me. As I stepped through the back door, the familiar warmth of the kitchen hit me, but the feeling of unease didn't let up. It was almost worse now, as if the house itself was pressing down on me, suffocating me with its silence. Pausing, I looked back over my shoulder. Mom was in the kitchen, humming quietly to herself as she worked over the stove. But when she turned to look at me, her eyes immediately narrowed. What in the world is that smell? I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The smell. The stench of burning hair, of something wrong, was still clinging to me like a shadow. It hadn't gone away, not even with the showering rush of fresh air. Passed away, I quickly blurted out. I slipped into some fresh manure in the field. Sorry, I didn't mean to track it in. She raised an eyebrow, studying me for a moment, but then she sighed, shaking her head. Well, you'd better go clean up before it gets worse. I'm not having you smelling like that around here. Go shower. Things still up well enough for you? Morgan asked, his smile limited to a... I nodded, relief flooding my chest, though it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I made my way to the bathroom, my footsteps heavy on the floor. The thought of the kite burned into my mind, but I pushed it away, hoping that the shower would wash it all off. I turned on the water, scalding hot, letting the steam fill the room as I stepped under the spray. The water cascaded over my skin, warm and comforting, and for a moment I closed my eyes, trying to push everything from my mind. When I finally stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in a towel, the smell was gone. Gone, like it had never been there. I looked into the bathroom mirror, my reflection blurry from the steam. My heart was still racing, my mind still reeling from the events of the morning, but the air around me seemed clearer now. Calmer, it felt. I stepped out of the bathroom, a wave of relief washing over me, trying to shake off the weirdness of everything. I was just overthinking it. After all, everything else seemed so normal. Until Dad barged in. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open, his face breaking into a grin as he held something behind his back. "Got something for you, kiddo," he said, his voice carrying a bit of excitement. He stepped forward and revealed what he was holding. My heart dropped. It was a kite, the same shape, the same color, the same tattered white tails fluttering in his hands, just like the one I had burned. "Where'd you get this?" I blurted out before I could stop myself, my mind racing to make sense of this sudden, overwhelming wave of déjà vu. How could he have possibly known? Dad's smile faltered for a moment, but then he shrugged. "Well, I felt bad about how I snapped at you yesterday. You didn't deserve that, and I don't always do a good job of showing you I care, so..." He hesitated before continuing, looking down at the kite. "I saw this in the city today. It kind of reminded me of the one you were flying the other day, and I thought you'd like it. You know, to make up for me telling you to return it. I didn't want you to feel bad about it." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I felt my stomach twist in a knot as I looked at the kite in his hands. My heart pounded against my chest. It was like the universe had decided to mock me. It was his. He used it badly. It was a test of his love, and I stood in amazement, clumsy. "This looks exactly like the one I had," I managed to say, my voice trembling despite myself. Dad's face softened, and he laughed a little, shrugging again. "I guess it does, doesn't it? It's not the same one, though. I just thought you'd like it." I stared at the kite for a long moment, my mind screaming at me to say something, anything, but all I could feel was the gnawing dread that had settled in my gut. I had burned that kite. I had destroyed it, and yet here it was, identical in every way. "Thanks," I finally forced out, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Not yet. Not when everything was so wrong. Dad smiled, oblivious to the turmoil swirling inside me. "No problem. Just don't let it get away from you, all right?" I nodded, the words caught in my throat. I couldn't even look at him now. I just wanted to run, to throw that kite as far away as I could and never see it again. But instead I stood there, staring at the kite in my hands, and wondered, what was going on? What had I really burned? Dad, still smiling, looked at me with that familiar gleam in his eye. "Hey, why don't we go outside and fly it together? You can show me how well it flies." I hesitated, glancing between him and the kite. My gut was telling me to refuse, to throw it in the trash, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The gift was from him, after all. and he was trying to make things right. Plus, I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I nodded stiffly. Sure, I guess we can do that. No, we have to do this. We headed outside, the sun bright against the sky, the air warm and inviting. It was a beautiful day, too perfect to ignore. I didn't want to spoil the moment, so I focused on the task at hand. Dad took the kite, and I stood back, watching as he expertly unspooled the string and let it catch the wind. Next to us, Pete began squatting down, handing the kite over to me. For a few moments, it was just normal. The kite soared gracefully, its bright colors standing out against the sky. Dad stood beside me, guiding it with ease, and everything felt like it should, like it was supposed to be this way. There was no strange tension in the air, no feeling of being watched, no unease. The kite was just a kite. See, Dad said, looking over at me with a smile. Just like you were flying it the other day. I watched him, my shoulders relaxing slightly as I began to let the strange thoughts slip away. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I had been overthinking it. There was nothing wrong with this kite. Nothing wrong with the way Dad was flying it. Everything felt good again. The kite danced in the sky, tethered to Dad's careful hands, and for a moment, I felt like everything was back to normal. Like the past few days had been some weird nightmare I could forget about. Dad was right. It was just a kite. I tried to focus on the kite, watching it glide smoothly through the air. But something felt off. The unease from earlier was creeping back into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes flicked toward the tree line, the path left uncleared ahead of me. There, at the very edge of the forest, I saw him, a figure in a straw hat, standing perfectly still, just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the light. But then, he took a step forward. Then, my heart skipped a beat. Another step. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see him moving closer, but my eyes betrayed me, my body frozen, unable to look away. "Dad," I whispered, voice trembling. "There's someone out there. There needs to be a response." I whispered into Stalia. Dad's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, his voice calm and soothing. "It's probably just a trick of the light, Ellie. Don't worry about it." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the figure, it was human. No, too human. It wasn't right. I could see the outline of him clearly now, his figure moving slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. My breath caught in my throat. "Dad, he's coming closer." Dad turned, still relaxed, a soft chuckle escaping him. "It's fine. Probably just someone walking through the woods. It's nothing to worry about. I'm part of your bigger picture, Joseph." But the figure kept coming, his steps slow, methodical, each one taking him closer. My stomach twisted. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My breath was shallow now. My eyes locked onto the man in the straw hat. He was too close, too real. I couldn't take it anymore. I buried my face in his chest, my hands gripping his shirt as if holding on to some semblance of safety. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, my body trembling as I tried to force the terror down. "Dad, please," I whispered into his chest, the words barely escaping my lips. Dad gently placed a hand on my back, rubbing in slow circles, trying to calm me. "Ellie, it's okay. It's just the wind playing tricks. Or maybe it's a curious anima. There's nothing to be afraid of." But when I pulled away from his chest and looked up, the figure was gone. Gone. No sign of him anywhere in the woods. I scanned the trees, my heart still racing. but the only thing I could see was the wind gently rustling the leaves. Hannah approached. I stared at the empty space where the figure had been, my breath still shaky, my heart thudding in my chest. The woods were quiet again, but the fear didn't fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still out there, hidden in the shadows. I tried to focus on the kite, but the breeze felt colder now, the sky darker. My dad's hand, warm on my shoulder, grounded me, but it didn't fully chase away the panic. He gave me a soft, reassuring smile, though I could see the concern in his eyes. "All right, Ellie," he said gently. "I think that's enough kite time for today. Don't you?" I nodded quickly, relieved that he was reading my nerves. I didn't want to be out here anymore. Not with that feeling gnawing at me. Dad tugged the string gently, pulling the kite down and folding it neatly. "Let's head inside," he said. "It's been a long day, and you've had enough excitement for one morning." The wind had died down, and the air felt colder now, the tension still hanging thick in the space between us. We started walking back toward the house, my mind still racing with what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, in the woods. As we passed the field and got closer to the house, I glanced back once more. The tree line was still, empty. No straw hat, no figure, just trees and the morning fog settling in. But that cold knot in my stomach remained. "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper. He smiled down at me, his voice light. "No problem, Ellie. Let's get inside and get some breakfast, all right?" I nodded, not trusting my own voice, and we walked inside, leaving the quiet woods behind. The stillness was overwhelming. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see him moving closer. But my eyes betrayed me, my body frozen, unable to look away. "Dad," I whispered, voice trembling. "There's someone out there." Dad's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, his voice calm and soothing. "It's probably just a trick of the light, Ellie. Don't worry about it." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the figure, it was human. No, too human. It wasn't right. I could see the outline of him clearly now, his figure moving slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. My breath caught in my throat. "Dad!" "He's coming closer," I said, bracing myself. Dad turned, still relaxed, a soft chuckle escaping him. "It's fine. Probably just someone walking through the woods. It's nothing to worry about." Oh, God. But the figure kept coming, his steps slow, methodical, each one taking him closer. My stomach twisted. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My breath was shallow now, my eyes locked onto the man in the straw hat. He was too close, too real. I couldn't take it anymore. I buried my face in his chest, my hands gripping his shirt as if holding on to some semblance of safety. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, my body trembling as I tried to force the terror down. "Dad, please," I whispered into his chest, the words barely escaping my lips. Dad gently placed a hand on my back, rubbing in slow circles, trying to calm me. "Ellie, it's okay. It's just the wind playing tricks, or maybe it's a curious anima. There's nothing to be afraid of." But when I pulled away from his chest and looked up, the figure was gone. Gone. No sign of him anywhere in the woods. I scanned the trees, my heart still racing, but the only thing I could see was the wind gently rustling the leaves. I stared at the empty space where the figure had been, my breath still shaky, my heart thudding in my chest. The woods were quiet again, but the fear didn't fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, hidden in the shadows. I tried to focus on the kite, but the breeze felt colder now, the sky darker. My dad's hand, warm on my shoulder, grounded me, but it didn't fully chase away the panic. He gave me a soft, reassuring smile, though I could see the concern in his eyes. "All right, Ellie," he said gently. "I think that's enough kite time for today, don't you?" I nodded quickly, relieved that he was reading my nerves. I didn't want to be out here anymore, not with that feeling gnawing at me. Dad tugged the string gently, pulling the kite down and folding it neatly. "Let's head inside," he said. "It's been a long day and you've had enough excitement for one morning." Her cheeks turned into a gentle smile. The wind had died down and the air felt colder now, the tension still hanging thick in the space between us. We started walking back toward the house, my mind still racing with what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, in the woods. As we passed the field and got closer to the house, I glanced back once more. The tree line was still, empty. No straw hat, no figure, just trees and the morning fog settling in. But that cold knot in my stomach remained. "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper. He smiled down at me, his voice light. "No problem, Ellie. Let's get inside and get some breakfast, all right?" I nodded, not trusting my own voice, and we walked inside, leaving the quiet woods behind. I slammed the door behind me, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper. He glanced up at me, concern creasing his brow. "Ellie, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm, steady. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to tell him that something was out there, something that wanted me, something that wasn't human, that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Exercise that had expanded my mind since my injury had helped me connect dots faster. There are many things that can't be made to see. Helped. "I'm fine," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I couldn't stop the trembling in my hands. I could still see him in my mind, standing at the edge of the trees, his presence heavy in the air. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. The wind howled outside, tugging at the edges of the house, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was pulling me back out there. But then, a sound, a distant creak, awoke me. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The next time I went outside, the world felt different. The air was too heavy, the sky too dark. The livestock were quiet, still. The ground beneath me felt too solid, like I was waiting for something. I took a step, then another, my feet dragging as though something was holding me back. The field stretched out before me, peaceful at first, but then it all changed. I looked up, and there he was. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Heal me." He stepped forward, slowly, his shadow stretching out toward me like a dark cloud. "No, not again." "I can't." I turned to run, but it was like the ground had turned to mud beneath my feet. Each step felt like I was sinking deeper, and the more I tried to escape, the closer he came. I glanced back, and that was when I knew it was too late. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, tugging at my clothes. The string was there. The string was pulling me. I could feel it around my chest, tightening, lifting me off the ground. I was floating, helpless, weightless. The earth grew smaller beneath me, and I knew then, with cold certainty, that I wasn't coming back down. I was his kite now, forever. I'd lived my whole life in the small, idyllic farming town of Harvest Hill, where the annual pumpkin festival is more than just an event. It's a cherished tradition that brings the entire community together. Every fall, the townsfolk gather in the town square, surrounded by the glowing red and yellow of autumn leaves, to celebrate the season's bounty and compete for the coveted title of the largest pumpkin. Unfortunately for me, I decided to spend the cold winters in paradise instead of pumpkin. For years, I had dreamed of winning that prize, but this year my hopes were higher than ever. I scowled and started for the stairway. Neither of us spoke until the stairs had reached. Nestled at the edge of town, my modest farmhouse is surrounded by meticulously tended gardens. Each morning, I wake at dawn, don my gardening gloves, and tend to my plants with the care and precision of a master craftsman. This year, my pride and joy was a massive pumpkin that I've nurtured from a tiny seedling into a colossal gourd. It sat in the center of my garden, its vibrant orange skin gleaming in the sunlight, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride every time I looked at it. However, there was one garden in Harvest Hill that always caught my eye with a mix of curiosity and unease: Old Farmer Joe's. His property, just next door to mine, was shrouded in mystery. The garden was overgrown and wild, yet his pumpkins always seemed to grow bigger and healthier than anyone else's. Joe was a reclusive, eccentric man who rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were often cryptic and unsettling. The townspeople often gossiped that he held secrets old and dark, but of course this was all wild speculation, and no one knew anything for sure. As the days grew shorter and the festival drew near, I found myself working tirelessly in my garden, determined to finally outdo Joe and claim the grand prize. The townsfolk noticed my dedication and would often stop by to admire my giant pumpkin, offering words of encouragement and praise. The excitement was tangible, and for the first time, I felt that victory was within my grasp. The day of the festival arrived with a crisp chill in the air. We were in the midst of autumn, and the town square was alive with activity, filled with stalls selling homemade pies, caramel apples, and other seasonal treats. Children ran around in costumes, laughing and playing, while adults admired the various pumpkins on display. My pumpkin, transported with great care, sat proudly among the contenders, drawing gasps of admiration from the crowd. As the judges made their rounds, carefully inspecting each entry, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. When they finally approached my pumpkin, their eyes widened in surprise, and I saw them exchange impressed glances. After what felt like an eternity, they announced the winner. My pumpkin had claimed the top prize, thanks to the flames. The crowd erupted in applause as I stepped forward to accept the trophy. My fellow townsfolk clapped me on the back and congratulated me, their faces beaming with genuine happiness. Amid the celebration, Old Farmer Joe approached me. His weathered face broke into a rare smile as he shook my hand, his grip firm and uncomfortably tight. "Congratulations," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "You've done well this year. But remember, there's always a secret to true growth. Besides the sun in the spring and the trees in the fall." His strange words lingered in my mind long after the festivities had ended and the crowd had dispersed. As I stood alone in my garden that evening, gazing at the enormous pumpkin that had brought me such joy, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. What did Joe mean by a secret to true growth? And why did his smile seem more like a warning than a congratulation? Little did I know. The answer to those questions would soon turn the essence of my existence upside down, revealing a dark secret that lay hidden beneath the fertile soil of Harvest Hill. My first night after the festival, I experienced fitful sleep and unsettling dreams. I kept waking up to the image of Old Farmer Joe's cryptic smile and the ominous tone in his voice. By the first light of morning, all the elation I'd felt in victory had faded, replaced by a gnawing curiosity about old Joe's parting words. I was determined to get to the bottom of it, so I decided to pay Joe a visit. Under the guise of thanking him for his congratulations, I approached his property, feeling apprehensive, yet determined to find out what he meant. His garden, as always, was an overgrown mess of vines and leaves, with enormous pumpkins peeking out from the undergrowth. The sheer size of his produce, even larger than mine, seemed almost unnatural. I found Joe in the back, hunched over a patch of particularly large pumpkins. He straightened up as I approached, wiping his hands on his worn overalls. "Morning, Joe," I called out, trying my best to sound casual. "I just wanted to thank you for your kind words yesterday." Joe looked up, his eyes sharp and piercing despite his age. Taking a deep breath, I decided to broach the subject directly. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about the secret to true growth. What did you mean by that?" For a moment, Joe said nothing. Then he motioned for me to follow him. We walked through his garden, the dense foliage brushing against us, until we reached an old, decrepit shed. Joe pushed open the door, revealing a cluttered space filled with gardening tools, jars of strange substances, and dusty old books. "Curiosity can be a dangerous thing," he said, rummaging through a pile of papers. "But since you've come this far, you deserve to know." He handed me an ancient leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "This," he said, "is a grimoire of sorts. It's been passed down through my family for generations. It contains knowledge that most would deem unnatural." I opened the book, my eyes scanning the strange symbols and diagrams that filled its pages. There were detailed instructions on rituals, strange ingredients, and dark incantations. My heart raced as I realized the implication of what I was seeing. "Is this magic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe nodded. "Not the kind you'd read about in fairy tales, but something much older and darker. It's a form of alchemy, using the natural world to bend nature to your will. My pumpkins thrive because of these rituals, but they come at a cost." It had been the ranger's 10 for a full minute before he even realized he had daydreaming, and saw the reality in front of him, and the reality fell to the floor. "What cost?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Joe's expression grew grave. "The soil here is enriched with more than just nutrients. It requires sacrifices, animal blood, bones, and sometimes other things. The magic demands a balance." I stared at him in disbelief, the weight of his words sinking in. "And my pumpkin? How did it grow so large?" Joe sighed. "I saw your dedication and wanted to help, so I enhanced your soil when you weren't looking. I thought it was harmless, a way to give you a taste of success. But I fear I may have set something in motion." Footnote: Joe saw through the motion, enhanced the result. Patrick nodded slowly. My mind reeled with the implications. My prize-winning pumpkin, the source of my pride and joy, was the result of dark, unnatural forces. The sense of accomplishment I had felt now seemed hollow and tainted. As I left Joe's garden, clutching the grimoire tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line. The vibrant orange of my pumpkin now seemed sinister, and the whispers of the town took on a more menacing tone. The once ideal Harvest Hill was now shrouded in a shadow of ancient secrets and dark magic, and I was at the center of it all. The true horror of my situation was beginning to unfold, and I knew that uncovering the full extent of Joe's secrets would come with a price that I might not be willing to pay. The days following old Farmer Joe's revelation were filled with dread but also undeniable fascination. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the grimoire he had given me. Instead, I spent hours poring over its ancient pages. trying to understand the arcane rituals and the nature of the dark forces at work. The more I read, the more I realized how deep and dangerous the magic was. As I delved deeper into the grimoire, I noticed strange changes in my garden. Other plants began to grow at an alarming rate, their leaves larger and more vibrant than ever before. The soil, once rich and loamy, took on a darker hue and a peculiar smell. The once comforting sounds of nature were now accompanied by airy whispers and rustling noises that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Despite my growing unease, I continued to seek Joe's guidance, hoping to find a way to undo what had been done. Our conversations grew increasingly bizarre. Joe spoke in riddles, his eyes often glazing over as if he were communicating with something unseen. He mentioned ancient spirits of the harvest, entities that demanded offerings in exchange for their gifts. "You've tapped into something old and powerful," Joe said one evening as we stood by the garden fence. "The spirits are pleased, but they are never satisfied for long. They will demand more." "What do you mean by more?" I asked, a sense of dread curling in my stomach. Plax murmured. Joe's face darkened. "The rituals require balance. You must give back to the earth what you take. The larger the bounty, the greater the sacrifice." That night, I awoke to strange noises outside my window. Peering into the darkness, I saw shadows moving in the garden, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the center of the garden, the light illuminated a horrifying sight. Small animals, rabbits, birds, and even a stray cat, lay dead among the plants, their bodies seemingly drained of life. The vines of the giant pumpkin had grown thicker, their tendrils wrapping around the lifeless creatures as if drawing nourishment from them. The pumpkin, which I'd severed from its roots to take it to the festival, was now reattached to the ground. Panic set in, and I realized that whatever magic had been used was spiraling out of control. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Desperate for a solution, I visited the town library to research the history of Harvest Hill and its connection to old Farmer Joe's family. The librarian, an elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's past, led me to a dusty archive filled with old newspapers and records. As I sifted through the yellowed pages, I uncovered stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena dating back generations. Each incident seemed to coincide with particularly bountiful harvests at Joe's property. One article detailed the sudden disappearance of a young girl during a pumpkin festival many years ago, hinting at foul play, but never proving anything. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Joe's family had long been rumored to practice dark rituals. The townsfolk, though wary, had always turned a blind eye due to the prosperity the harvests brought. So take this seed of power and pray it. Back at home, I began to experience vivid nightmares. I dreamt of being buried alive, of roots and vines slowly constricting around my body, pulling me deeper into the earth. Each morning I awoke drenched in sweat, the images lingering in my mind. Sarah, my wife, noticed the change in me. "You've been acting strange," she said one morning, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full truth, just stress from the festival. I lied, trying to sound convincing. "I'll be fine." But Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed. Neighbors began to comment on the unusual growth in my garden, their curiosity tinged with suspicion. I could see the unease in their eyes, the way they whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. Thinking of Sarah, my mind took a mental pass through most of my waking hours. Determined to find a way to reverse the dark magic, I began documenting everything. I took photos of the garden, recorded the strange noises, and even collected samples of the soil. My collection of evidence grew. but so did my paranoia. I felt like I was being watched, not just by Joe, but by something else, something ancient and malevolent. One night, while reviewing the footage from my garden camera, I saw a shadowy figure lurking near the pumpkin patch. It wasn't Joe. The figure was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with a stealthy purpose. My blood ran cold as I realized the figure was performing a ritual, chanting words I couldn't understand. The next morning, I found the pumpkin even larger, its vines more aggressive. In a moment of clarity, I confronted Joe one last time. "I've seen the rituals. I know what you've done," I said, my voice trembling with anger and fear. "Tell me how to stop it." Joe sighed, his shoulders slumping as if carrying the weight of centuries. "You can't stop it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The spirits are already here. The only way to appease them is with a greater sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" I demanded, my mind racing through the possibilities. Joe looked at me with a mix of pity and resignation. "You know what kind," he said. "Blood for growth. Life for life." As his words sank in, I realized the true horror of my situation. The price of my success was far greater than I could have ever imagined, and the darkness I had unleashed was now beyond my control. The situation reached a horrifying turning point on a cold, moonless night. The ghostly quiet of the garden was shattered by an unsettling noise, a low hum that seemed to resonate from the very earth itself. Unable to sleep, I decided to investigate, clutching the grimoire tightly and armed with a flashlight. As I stepped into the garden, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted vines of my giant pumpkin, which now seemed almost sentient, writhing and pulsing as if alive. My heart pounded as I moved closer, the sense of impending doom thick in the air. Suddenly I saw it, an area of disturbed soil near the pumpkin, freshly turned and dark with moisture. Kneeling down, I used my hands to brush away the loose dirt, uncovering something that made my blood run cold. Beneath the soil were the remains of small animals, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. Among them, a human hand protruded, the flesh pale and lifeless. A wave of nausea swept over me as I realized the full extent of the horror. This was no longer just about a giant pumpkin or an eccentric neighbor. The garden had become a graveyard, and the dark magic I had unknowingly nurtured now demanded human lives as its true price. Desperate for answers, I turned to the grimoire, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The ancient text described a ritual of appeasement, a way to communicate with the spirits of the harvest. The instructions were clear but chilling. A sacrifice was needed to stop the dark forces, one that matched the scale of the magic used. Fueled by feelings of both fear and purpose, I stormed over to Joe's house, the grimoire clutched in my hand. He met me at the door, his expression one of grim understanding. "I found the bodies, Joe," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and horror. "How do I stop this?" Joe sighed, his face etched with lines of regret and sorrow. "I warned you about the cost," he said softly. "The spirits demand balance. The greater the gift, the greater the sacrifice." "Living creatures. Tell me how to end it," I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. Joe led me to his cluttered shed once more. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a small, intricately carved wooden box. Opening it, he revealed a ceremonial dagger and a piece of parchment covered in ancient runes. "This is the ritual of severance," he explained. "It's the only way to break the bond with the spirits. But it requires a life for a life." My heart sank as I realized the implications. The life of someone I loved would have to be sacrificed to undo the dark magic that had taken hold of my garden. The weight of this knowledge bore down on me like a crushing force. Returning home, I found Sarah waiting for me, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" she asked. "You've been so distant, and the garden. It feels wrong," torn between the need to protect her and the truth of what I had discovered. I decided to tell her everything. As I recounted the dark history of old Farmer Joe's magic and the horrific revelation in the garden, Sarah's face paled. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous." But I knew running wouldn't solve the problem. The spirits were bound to the land, and they wouldn't let us escape so easily. The only way to free ourselves was to complete the ritual. But I couldn't bring myself to suggest the unthinkable. In the days that followed, the garden's transformation accelerated. The giant pumpkin grew even larger, its vines spreading like a cancer across the property, suffocating everything in their path. The eerie hum became a constant presence, a sinister reminder of the dark forces at play. As the situation grew more dire, I spent hours each day in the library, seeking any alternative to the ritual of severance. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, I stumbled upon an old forgotten diary tucked away in the archives. I expected to find people. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in Harvest Hill over a century ago. Her entries detailed her own encounters with the dark magic and the spirits of the harvest. In her final entry, she wrote of a similar situation, describing the unbearable choice she had to make to protect her family. "My husband's life was the price I paid," Margaret wrote, "but the spirits are never truly satisfied. They always return, hungry for more. The cycle must be broken, or it will continue forever." With a sinking heart, I realized the full horror of what Joe had been trying to tell me. The ritual of severance might only be a temporary solution. The spirit's hunger could not be sated for long, and the dark magic would eventually return, demanding new sacrifices. Standing in my garden that night, surrounded by the monstrous vines and the eerie hum, I felt the weight of an impossible decision. The midpoint of my journey had revealed the true nature of the darkness I faced, and the path ahead was fraught with danger and sacrifice. In the distance, old Farmer Joe's house stood in shadow, a silent witness to the legacy of the dark magic. As I stared at the giant pumpkin, its surface pulsating with a malevolent life, I knew that the hardest part of my ordeal was yet to come. The night of the final confrontation arrived, shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow all light. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the pervasive hum of the restless spirits. The giant pumpkin, now a monstrous, grotesque behemoth, dominated the garden, its vines twisting and writhing with a life of their own. Desperate to end the nightmare, I gathered the necessary items for the ritual of severance: the ceremonial dagger, the ancient parchment, and a vial of my own blood. Each item felt like a lead weight in my hands, the significance of what I was about to do pressing down on me. Sarah stood by my side, her face pale but resolute. She had insisted on being there, despite my attempts to protect her from the full horror of the situation. Her presence gave me strength, but also deepened my fear of what might come. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. Together, we walked to the heart of the garden, where the monstrous pumpkin loomed. I knelt before the pumpkin, spreading the parchment on the ground and placing the dagger and vial beside it. With a deep breath, I began to chant the incantation from the grimoire, my voice shaking but gaining strength as I went on. The words felt foreign and ancient, resonating with a power that made the air around us vibrate. The vines reacted almost immediately, writhing more violently, as if sensing the impending threat. The hum grew louder, filling my ears and making it difficult to concentrate. I took the vial of blood and poured it onto the parchment, watching as the dark liquid seeped into the ancient runes, making them glow with an eerie light. As I continued the chant, I felt a presence growing stronger, an unseen force that seemed to watch and judge my every move. The final part of the ritual required the sacrifice of a life, one that had been touched by the dark magic. I had hoped that the animal sacrifices Joe had made would be enough, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Tears streamed down my face as I raised the ceremonial dagger. I turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with fear and understanding. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. Before I could act, a powerful force knocked me to the ground, the dagger flying from my hand. The vines surged forward, wrapping around Sarah and lifting her into the air. She screamed, struggling against the crushing grip of the tendrils. "No!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet and grabbing the dagger. I slashed at the vines, but more took their place, pulling Sarah towards the monstrous pumpkin. Desperation fueled my actions as I hacked and cut, my hands slick with blood from the thorny tendrils. Suddenly, old Farmer Joe appeared, his face a mask of determination and sorrow. "This is my doing," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "I have to set it right." With a swift motion, he took the dagger from my hand and plunged it into his own chest. The vines recoiled, releasing Sarah and retracting towards the pumpkin. Joe fell to the ground, blood pooling around him as he chanted the final words of the ritual. The air crackled with energy as the ground trembled beneath our feet. The giant pumpkin began to wither, its vibrant orange fading to a sickly brown. The vines shriveled and turned to dust, releasing a cloud of dark, acrid smoke. The hum intensified, reaching a deafening crescendo before abruptly stopping. Joe's body lay still, his sacrifice complete. The garden fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the dark magic dissipated. The spirits, momentarily appeased by Joe's selfless act, retreated into the earth, their hunger sated for now. Zara and I stood in stunned silence, the horror of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The garden, once a source of pride and joy, was now a barren wasteland, the remnants of the dark magic leaving an indelible mark. In the darkness, my heart thumped loudly. We buried Joe next to his monstrous pumpkin, marking his grave with a simple stone. His sacrifice had saved us, but the cost had been immeasurable. As we left the garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching, waiting for their next opportunity. The climax of our ordeal had revealed the true price of tampering with forces beyond our understanding. The darkness that had taken root in Harvest Hill was not so easily vanquished, and the memory of that fateful night would haunt us forever. The ultimate confrontation had ended, but the scars it left behind would remain, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the surface of our once ideal town. The days following the climactic confrontation were a blur of exhaustion and grief. The garden, once the pride of my efforts, was now a desolate patch of scorched earth and withered plants. The giant pumpkin had collapsed into a decaying heap, its vibrant orange hue now a sickly brown. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over our home seemed to dissipate, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Sarah and I struggled to come to terms with the events that had transpired. We moved through our daily routines and a daze, haunted by the memories of that fateful night. Old Farmer Joe's sacrifice had saved us, but the price had been high, and the weight of guilt and sorrow was overwhelming. Instead of defeating it, News of the bizarre occurrences spread quickly through Harvest Hill. The townspeople, initially skeptical, became increasingly curious and wary. They whispered about the giant pumpkin, the strange lights, and the eerie hum that had emanated from our property. Joe's sudden death added to the sense of mystery and fear that gripped the town. One afternoon, the town council paid us a visit. They stood in our barren garden, their faces a mixture of disbelief and concern. "What happened here?" asked Mayor Thompson, his voice filled with apprehension. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "There was an incident," I said slowly. "Old Farmer Joe tried to help us, but things got out of control. He sacrificed himself to stop it." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. "We've heard rumors about Joe and his family," said Mrs. Henderson, the town librarian. "Dark rumors. Is there any truth to them?" "Are you afraid?" I nodded reluctantly. Joe had a knowledge of ancient rituals, a kind of dark magic. It's what caused the giant pumpkin to grow so large, but it came with a price. The council members fell silent, absorbing the gravity of my words. "We need to ensure this never happens again," said Mayor Thompson finally. "The town must be protected." Sarah and I knew we couldn't stay in Harvest Hill. The memories were too painful, the whispers too loud. We decided to sell our property and move to a neighboring town, hoping to find a fresh start away from the darkness that had consumed our lives. As we packed our belongings, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The grimoire, now hidden away in a locked chest, seemed to call to me, its pages filled with secrets I could never unlearn. I debated whether to destroy it, but something held me back. The fear that the knowledge within might be needed again. On our last day in Harvest Hill, Sarah and I visited Joe's grave. We placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the simple stone marker, a silent thank you for his sacrifice. The air was still, the oppressive presence of the spirits gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were not entirely vanquished. A reservation might be fine for the body by post-mortem, but a reservation laid to rest the same day has been reset. Harvest Hill took measures to prevent a recurrence of the dark magic. The town council declared Joe's property off limits, eventually bulldozing the decrepit shed and covering the garden with fresh soil. They held a town meeting to discuss the strange events, urging residents to remain vigilant and to report any unusual occurrences. The town slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the giant pumpkin and the dark rituals lingered. Stories and legends grew around the events, becoming a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Harvest Hill would never forget the price of tampering with forces beyond their understanding. In our new town, Sarah and I worked hard to rebuild our lives. The shadow of Harvest Hill loomed over us, but we found solace in each other's company and the fresh start we had created. We planted a small garden, careful to use only natural methods, and watched as it flourished without the taint of dark magic. But the past was never far behind. I kept the grimoire hidden, a reminder of the danger that knowledge could bring. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I would sometimes hear the faint hum of the spirits in my dreams, a chilling reminder of the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. Our new life was a testament to resilience and the power of love, but it was also a constant struggle to keep the shadows at bay. The events in Harvest Hill had changed us forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. In the end, we learned to live with the memory, finding strength in our shared experiences and the hope that we could prevent such horrors from ever happening again. This part of our story was a quiet one, marked by the slow but steady process of healing and the enduring reminder of the price we had paid for our brush with darkness. Years passed, and Sarah and I slowly built a peaceful life in our new town. The horrors of Harvest Hill faded into distant memories, although the scars always remained. We had a child, a bright and curious boy named Tommy, who brought joy and light into our lives. Our small garden flourished naturally, free from any dark influences. One crisp autumn evening, as we were putting Tommy to bed, he handed me a small, carved wooden box he had found while playing in the attic. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. It was the same intricate design as the box Joe had used to store the ceremonial dagger. "Daddy, look what I found," Tommy said, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's full of old papers and stuff." With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside were several yellowed pieces of parchment covered in familiar runes and a small vial of dark, dried liquid. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. The remnants of the grimoire and the tools for dark rituals. Late that night, after Sarah and Tommy were asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the contents of the box spread before me. My mind raced as I tried to understand how these items had followed us. Had the spirits somehow transferred their connection to our new home? Or had the dark magic never truly left me? As I studied the parchments, a familiar hum began to fill the air. Soft at first, then growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the horrifying truth. The spirits had found us, and they were growing restless once again. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the kitchen, and the air grew icy cold. I turned, expecting to see some ghastly apparition, but instead, there was nothing. The hum, however, persisted, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just out of sight. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, I knew I had to act quickly. I retrieved the hidden grimoire and compared it to the new parchments, hoping to find a way to protect my family. As I read, it became clear that the spirits were not simply satisfied with the occasional sacrifice. They sought to bind themselves permanently to a powerful source of life, such as a child. Panic surged through me as I realized their target was Tommy. Desperate to shield him from the impending danger, I decided to confront the spirits directly. I returned to the garden, now bathed in the eerie glow of the full moon, clutching the grimoire and the ceremonial items. Standing in the center of the garden, I began to chant the incantations from the grimoire, calling forth the spirits. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew thick with a palpable energy. The vines around the garden began to stir, twisting and curling as if awakened by my words. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and indistinct. It was the same figure I had seen in the garden all those years ago, the entity that had fed on the sacrifices. It spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You have summoned us," it intoned, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "What do you seek?" "Release my family," I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "You've taken enough. Let us live in peace." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Desperate, I offered myself in place of my son. "Take me," I pleaded. "Just leave my family alone." The spirit considered my offer, its eyes narrowing. "A noble sacrifice," it mused. "But we require something more. Your life alone is not enough. You must bind your bloodline to us, ensuring that our connection endures." The full weight of the spirit's demand crashed down on me. Binding my bloodline meant condemning future generations to the same darkness I had tried so hard to escape. But there was no other way to protect Tommy and ensure his immediate safety. With a heavy heart, I agreed. "I will bind my bloodline to you," I said, my voice breaking. "But spare my son, and allow us to live in peace for as long as we can." The spirit's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "So be it," it said, extending a shadowy hand. "Seal the pact." With trembling hands, I used the ceremonial dagger to cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the ancient parchment. The runes glowed bright red, and the hum intensified, resonating through the garden and into the night. As the ritual concluded, the shadowy figure dissipated, and the garden fell silent once more. The oppressive presence lifted, leaving me drained, but relieved. I returned to the house, where Sarah and Tommy slept soundly, unaware of the pact that had been made. The next morning, I buried the grimoire and the ceremonial items deep in the forest, far from our home. The garden slowly returned to its natural state, free from the monstrous growths and eerie hum. Life continued, seemingly peaceful, but I could never forget the price we had paid. Years later, as I watched Tommy grow into a bright and inquisitive young man, I couldn't help but feel a pang of dread. The spirit's hunger had been sated for now, but the pact I had made would hang over our family like a dark cloud, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees or the moon cast long shadows across the yard, I could still hear the faint, sinister hum, a reminder that the spirits were always watching, waiting for the next chapter of our bloodline to unfold. I was 7 when I moved into that house at Ashbrook Lane. At least that's what my parents tell me. My recollection of that time is vague. I have memories of the big tree on our lawn, running round the garden with the boy next door, and I remember sitting on the living room floor playing with my He-Man figures. But my most vivid memories are of the recurring nightmares. To the best of my knowledge, they happened every night I stayed in that house. The first time I woke during the early hours with a feeling that I was being watched. I lay there in the dark, listening intently, scared to move in case it drew the prowler's attention. I could hear or see nothing, but that feeling wouldn't go away. There was somebody or something in the room with me. I screwed up my eyes tightly, hoping it would just pass me by. I felt the bed shake, and I stiffened up like a statue, afraid to make even the slightest movement. And then I heard the sound of raspy breathing from the foot of the bed. It moved round the side of me, then stopped. Moments passed silently. Then, I felt the breath on my face. Instinctively, I opened my eyes. I saw an emaciated man in a lab coat looming over me, an expression of horror etched into his pale, gaunt face, veins bulging from his forehead. I tried to scream, but he grasped me around the throat with his skeleton-like fingers and dragged me out of bed. Jerking and contorting, I tried to grab onto something to stop him from taking me. He pulled me out of my room onto the landing where I gripped the stair rail. He pulled at my arms, and then at my feet, and I kicked and screamed in a furious fight for my freedom. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was waking up in my parents' bed. They had found me sleepwalking across the landing in the middle of the night. I had a lot of nightmares as a kid, which was put down to my active imagination, but sleepwalking? That was a first. I saw him again the following night. He yanked me from my bed with no warning, and this time he managed to pull me down the stairs. Once again, I woke in my parents' bed. My dad had woken in the night and found me lying at the foot of the stairs. I worked myself into such a panic over these dreams that my parents allowed me to stay up late with them one night. We watched TV, and I strained to stay awake. I don't remember going to bed that night. I just found myself sitting on the stairs, observing the hallway, waiting for him to arrive. Minutes ticked away on the hallway clock, then part of the wall opened up to reveal a concealed doorway from which he emerged. He was wearing the same lab coat I'd seen him wear before, only this time it was smeared with blood. Whatever he'd been doing inside that room, I didn't want to find out. I watched with dread as he slowly and methodically slipped a pair of rubber surgical gloves into his hands. He tented his fingers together, then turned and looked directly at me with his intense, deep-set eyes. A pained grimace stretched across his chalky face. I rushed upstairs, calling out for help as he crawled behind me, swiping at my heels. I ran into my parents' bedroom. They were asleep and unaware of the commotion. Before I could reach their bed and shake them awake, my pursuer snatched me up in his bony arms and started pulling me away. I managed to grab onto the door frame, and despite his efforts, he could not prise me from it. He relented for a moment, his breath heavy and labored against my neck. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a scalpel before slicing deep into my hands. I released my grip on the doorframe as blood dripped between my fingers. I shrieked out, but there was no sound. I could see Mom and Dad lying there, fast asleep, oblivious, as this withered specter hauled me out of their room and all the way down to the bottom of the stairs. I tried to claw my way back, leaving streaks of blood on the carpets and walls in my wake. He pressed his fingers against my throat. I whimpered and choked, and my limbs thrashed around in a frenzy. At that moment, the hallway clock chimed, and he suddenly abandoned his fight. I looked up to see the emaciated figure creeping back through the door from where it came. The door sealed shut, disappearing into the wall as though it never existed. A point came where I starting to confuse my dreams with reality. I couldn't tell if this was all in my mind or actually happening to me in the middle of the night. During the daylight hours, I examined the wall in the hallway, looking to see if there was some indication of a secret door. I told my parents and my nan about the dreams, and though I never doubted their concern, there was not a lot they could do except reassure me. I stayed with my parents when I got particularly distressed, either in their bed or we'd bring the blankets and pillows downstairs and have a sleepover in the living room. Nothing helped. My evil tormentor found me night after night, waiting until Mom and Dad were asleep before hauling me away. I tried to call out, but my screams were always silent as he gripped his hand round my throat. He grew increasingly violent as he tried in vain to drag me into his secret room. Sometimes he would use his scalpel across my hands or under my fingernails. Other times he would inject me with a syringe, and it wasn't unusual for him to bite my fingers. As I prepared for the dreams, I rehearsed how I would try to fight him off, what I could grab onto as he dragged me downstairs. I knew if I could just hold out until the clock chimed, then I would survive another night, because that's when his door sealed shut. What terrified me most was the realization that if he got me into his secret room before the chime of the clock, the door would seal behind us and nobody would ever see or hear from me again. I don't remember much else about that house, but we didn't stay long. We moved in with my nan for a while, and even though there wasn't much room for all of us, at least those nightmares stopped. And so did the sleepwalking. Of course, I never forgot about those dreams. How could I? But I figured I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, and I never considered them particularly abnormal. That is, until my teens, when I started to suspect something more sinister was at play. I was looking through old photo albums with my parents when we came across some from our old house at Ashbrook Lane. Something wasn't right about that house, I heard my mom say to my dad. This roused my curiosity. What do you mean, Mom? Well, I used to have bad feelings and nightmares when we were living there, she added. My dad tried to change the subject, but I persisted. What sort of nightmares? I inquired. I don't want to go into it. It's violent and disturbing dreams. I had recurring nightmares in that house too, I said. You were too young to remember your dreams, my dad interrupted. You probably just picked up on something you heard us talking about. I felt insulted, like they were dismissing me, but you don't forget dreams like those. I tried pushing for more information. They weren't forthcoming. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that we were able to talk about it again. I was in the living room with my parents and my dad was reading the paper. He casually told my mom, our old house in Ashbrook Lane is up for sale again. Nobody stays there long, she replied. It makes you wonder. My dad nodded in agreement. So what exactly happened at that house? I interjected. Maybe it was because so much time had passed, or perhaps it's because I was older, but they were more open with me this time. My mom explained how she'd had visions of a violent murder, dead bodies lying on the floor, blood all over the walls, and she claimed she had felt a presence. When she was alone, she would often hear crying, and it sounded like it was coming from inside the house. She also revealed that my aunt and uncle had come down from Manchester to stay one weekend and woke in the middle of the night to see a figure of a tall man at the bottom of the bed. Was he wearing a lab coat, or did they see his face? I asked, recalling my dreams. They weren't specific. They said they saw a dark figure wearing a top hat. My aunt and uncle had passed away by this point, so I was unable to ask them about their experiences, but Mom explained that they were so distressed by the incident, they returned home the next day. I asked my dad, "Did you have anything weird happen?" My dad has always been a very grounded skeptic, but I knew something had affected him too, though he wouldn't admit it. "There was just an uncomfortable feeling," he said, and volunteered nothing more. Ever since learning of my mom, aunt, and uncle's experiences in that house, I've been overwhelmed with curiosity. Like my dad, I'm quite the skeptic, and I was convinced there's a rational explanation for all this. Even so, I wanted to know more about that house. From time to time, I would check the newspaper, and just as my parents had said, the house was rarely occupied for more than 6 months before going up for sale. There wasn't much more I could find out at this time. I'm sure the information and history is available in some archive somewhere, but I wouldn't know where to start. However, I was passing by that area one day and got the idea to drive by the house. It was unoccupied, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary and felt no chills or foreboding. It was just an old house. But still, I wanted to know more. I noted down the phone number on the for sale sign, and later that day, I called the estate agents and requested a viewing. The lady who met me for the viewing introduced herself as Andrea. We went inside, and immediately I felt a shiver run over my body. It was probably my mind running away with me, but I got this eerie feeling. I can only describe it as being like the tension that lingers in the air after a big argument. If I'm honest, I barely recognized the interior of the house. My memory was vague, but there was one area that brought to mind those recurring nightmares I had as a child, and that was the hallway. I tried not to draw attention to myself, and continued the tour as Andrea gave me her sales pitch. As we walked around, I was convinced that the wall in the hallway was hiding something. "What's behind this wall?" I asked. The look on her face at that moment could disguise none of the lies she proceeded to tell me. First, she told me there was nothing there. It wasn't my intention to make her uncomfortable, but I'd come this far, and I wanted some answers. "There's at least 15 foot between here and the external wall," I pointed out. I heard her mumbling on about an old boiler room that had been bricked over, but she stopped mid-sentence when I started knocking against the wall. This was not my usual kind of behavior. It was as though I'd been consumed by an obsession. "You know something, don't you?" Andrea asked me, a tone of surrender in her voice. "I used to live here as a kid. Something isn't right about this house, is it?" Although still apprehensive, it was as if I'd freed her from an eternal silence. It could cost me my job if I told you. "It can't be much worse than I already suspect," I said. "Was somebody murdered here?" She hesitated and took a cautious glance over her shoulder. "Do you mind if we talk about this somewhere else? I'm really not comfortable talking about it here." We decided to go for a coffee, and this is what I learned. In 1953, Dr. Henry Fenton moved into Ashbrook Lane with his wife, Mary, and their teenage son, Raymond. He had the lower part of the house converted into a doctor's practice, and the upper floor would serve as their living quarters. Things were going well for the Fentons, and business was thriving, and then, one day, Mary fell down the stairs in their home and broke her neck. She died instantly. Henry reacted to the tragedy by immersing himself in his work, using the practice as a distraction from the heartache. Raymond, on the other hand, was struggling to come to terms with his mother's death. With his father too busy to offer the emotional support he needed, he started to drift. He fell in with a bad crowd, started skipping school, and there were a couple of times he'd been caught drinking or brawling and was escorted home by police. Henry barely noticed nor cared during this time. Once he closed his practice for the day, he would collapse into his armchair and attempt to repress his grief with liquor. Some nights he'd drink himself into a coma. Other nights he would fly into a rage, smashing furniture and throwing things around the room. And one of those times it was his son who bore the brunt of his temper. Raymond was taken in by his grandparents soon after, leaving Henry Fenton all alone in that house on Ashbrook Lane. Later that year, on a cold autumn night, Henry was woken by a disturbance from downstairs. Emboldened by the liquor, he decided to go and confront the intruder. His practice was the only thing he had going for him, and he refused to let some thug take that away. Henry tiptoed downstairs in the darkness. He saw the light of a torch in the far room and heard the intruder rummaging through cupboards and shelves, probably some junkie after the drugs and syringes he kept on the premises. Henry snuck into his office, withdrew a scalpel from a drawer, and tucked into a corner, and waited. The intruder entered the room, a rucksack over his shoulder and his face covered by a black mask. Henry sprung out of the darkness brandishing the scalpel and ordered him to drop his bag. The masked man panicked and lunged towards him, attempting to push past and make his escape. Henry swiped out blindly as he fell backwards against the wall. The intruder staggered along the hallway and opened the front door before collapsing on the doorstep. Henry got to his feet and approached the fallen man. Blood gushed from a deep incision across his throat from where the scalpel had made contact. Henry pulled the mask from the man's head to clear his airways. Staring back at him in the moonlight, eyes wide with terror, Henry saw the face of his son, Raymond. His heart wrenched at the sight before him. What had he done? How could he have known? His professional instincts kicked in and he sprung to action. Raymond thrashed about, choking and gurgling on his own blood as his father gripped his throat, pressing his bony fingers firmly against the wound in an attempt to contain the bleeding. He proceeded to drag him towards his office, where he could clamp and stitch the laceration. By the time he got him there, however, it was too late. Patients turned up to the practice the following day to find Raymond cradled in Dr. Fenton's arms, unable to come to terms with killing his own son. Henry had turned the scalpel upon himself, slashing his own wrists before bleeding to death on the floor of his office. Rainbow Creek isn't the most interesting town, and it likely wouldn't exist at all if not for the 2 colleges it was built around, or the federal prison a few miles outside of town. It's a small city nestled in the Montana mountains, and while the locals are happy to live the small city life, college students, like me, crave things that remind us of the cities we came from. That's what brought me into Gannon's antique shop. Back home, my mother would take me antiquing when with her. She had a taste for the old and unusual, and as I was nearing the end of my first semester of my freshman year, I found myself feeling homesick. So, one day, as the cold late autumn air nipped at my skin on my evening walk, I finally decided it was time to drop into the old antique store. There was an old bell that rang as I opened the door, and the old man behind the cash register barely acknowledged my presence. Looking up from a stack of old documents he was reading that I guessed must have something to do with the jeweled sword laid out on the countertop. I started browsing the wares and was quick to notice that this was unlike any antique shop I'd ever been in before. The antique stores I was used to shopping at with my mom had old things, some up to maybe 200 years old, but this place was in an entirely different class. Old was not a strong enough word for many of the items old man Gannon had for sale. Many of them would be better classified as antiquities. The newest item I found was labeled as being from the year 1852, but most were older than the 15th century, and some were even marked as being over 2,000 years old. It was one of these older items that caught my attention. It was a bronze figurine, roughly 6 inches tall, of a winged, goat-headed, hermaphroditic creature with serpents crawling across its belly. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing every detail in clear relief with such a lifelike appearance that I could almost see it move. The eyes were made of some kind of deep red jewel that seemed to glint with a light all their own. The body was completely corrosion-free and shone like it had just been polished. It was ugly and beautiful. It was alluring and horrifying. I had to have it. I checked the label next to it. It reads simply Idol of Baphomet circa 500 CE $3,600. I was no expert on ancient artifacts, but I did know that high-quality art from before the Renaissance was ridiculously expensive, and this figurine, this idol, was far more finely crafted than anything I had seen in museums. If it was real, it was a true masterwork of antiquity, and that made it vastly underpriced. Still, $3,600 is a lot of money. It was, in fact, exactly as much money as I had in my bank account after paying bills for the month. I'd been saving for a rainy day, setting aside something from every paycheck I'd received since I got my first part-time job at the age of 16, and it represented my life savings, but this idol was too good an opportunity to pass up. I took it to the checkout counter and got old man Gannon's attention. "I want to buy this," I declared. He looked at me, and he looked at the small idol I had set on the counter, then back at me again. "I don't think you want that particular item," he replied. "It's special. You don't pick it, it picks you." I scoffed. "Don't insult me, old man," I replied testily. "I may just be a student, but I have enough money for this." I handed him the label with the price listed, and he examined it intensely. "That's not the price I put on it," he said slowly. "It's the price," I replied hastily, sensing that the old man was going to claim the idol was supposed to cost more before jacking the price up. In fact, I was certain of it. An item of that age and quality was definitely worth more. He probably left a zero out of the price by accident. "It's the price," I repeated, "and I have exactly enough money to pay for it." I produced my debit card from my wallet and held it out to him. He stared at me thoughtfully for a moment before taking my card and running it. The charge came up as good. "It seems the idol has chosen you after all," he said, and I could swear I detected a hint of sadness, maybe pity in his voice. "Be careful with it." "Wait here," he commanded, then went into the back room before reappearing a minute later with a binder. "This is the provenance of your antique," he said in a businesslike tone. "Be sure to read it as soon as you get home. It tells you the story of this particular item as far back as is known. There are gaps in the history, but that's expected for an item of this age." I took the binder from him and flipped it open. It was filled with documents and protectors, half of them old and in other languages, and the other half new translations to English placed in a separate protector behind each original document. "I don't forget to read them," old man Gannon said warningly as he packaged my new idol for transport home. "Always know the details of anything you buy, new or old." "Sure thing," I said dismissively as I took the package from him and scooped up the provenance binder. "I'll read it at my first opportunity." If only I had actually done as I said, maybe I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now. I hurried home with my prize and placed it in the center on my desk's bookshelf. I stepped back to admire it, snapped a picture with my phone, texted it to my mom, and called her to tell her about my amazing find. We spoke for a little more than an hour, a lot of our conversation being speculation about the true value of such an artifact, wrapping up with a promise that we would take it to an appraiser when I came home for the summer. It was early evening by that time, and all of my friends were done with classes for the day, so I put the binder of provenance on the bookshelf, left to go party with the girls, and promptly forgot about it. I got home late and exhausted, so tired that I fell into bed fully clothed, and I swear I was asleep before I even hit the mattress. I had vividly troubled dreams, visions of damned souls screaming in eternal torment in hell, images of violence and bloodshed among the living. Lies, pain, and betrayal were all around. Behind it all, ever in the background, was a winged, goat-headed figure with glowing red eyes and an evil smile splayed across its caprine lips. The next day was tough, not just because I stayed out too late and my first class was early, but also because my dreams seemed to have sapped the rest from my sleep, leaving me slow and foggy all day long. I barely made it through my classes, went to my dorm, and promptly went to bed despite it being early afternoon. My dreams remained troubled, filling my head with the same visions as the night before, only closer, more present this time. I could swear I actually smelled the stench of sulfur and burnt flesh. I could feel the pain and anguish of betrayed lovers. I could taste the iron blood in my mouth as people were gruesomely murdered. It mixed in with the overwhelming cacophony of torment. I began to feel my own response. Horror and revulsion gripped my heart, and I felt like I was suffocating, barely able to breathe as I choked on the smoke of billions of damned souls. I felt physical pain and my mind screamed to wake up, but I could not. I was trapped in the hell world of my dreams, and there was no escape. I was bound to sleep, forced to suffer along with the many, many tortured souls that filled my every sensation. It felt like a lifetime that night, and when I woke up to my alarm blaring next to my head, it was with a great gasp for air, trembling, and a racing heart that took many minutes to slow down as I went from gasping to hyperventilating as the panic overwhelmed me. It was only when I was able to convince myself that it had all been a dream, a horrible, horrible dream, and the waking world was safe that I finally was able to slow down my breathing and eventually get myself under control. I looked over to my desk and set my eyes upon the idol of Baphomet sitting in a place of honor where it was easily visible. Seeing it, I was reminded of how the demonic figure in my dreams had taken on the form of my new relic, and I wondered for a moment if the two were somehow connected. I walked over and picked it up, examining it closely from all angles. It was so lifelike, and the gem eyes were so lustrous that they seemed to glow much like the eyes of the dream demon. "How peculiar," I muttered quietly. "Why are you showing up in my nightmares? You're beautiful." I stared into the luminous gemstone eyes of the idol as I spoke, and it felt as though they were staring back at me until I finally set it down in its place of honor and left to attend my first class of the day. My friend Geraldine could see that I was out of sorts during our first class and caught up to me when it was over. "What's going on?" she inquired. "You look like something's eating you." "You have no idea," I replied exasperatedly. "Then give me the idea," she quipped. Her manner may have been on the sassy side, but I knew she was sincere. "I've been having nightmares the last couple of nights," I told her. "Real bad ones, and they feel more like I'm actually there than like I'm dreaming." I trailed off at the end, then continued. "But that's ridiculous, right? They're just dreams. I don't really feel, smell, and taste anything in them any more than I see and hear in a normal dream. At least, I don't think so." Geraldine looked thoughtful, her thin, arched eyebrows pinched in concern. "I don't think so," she replied. "But then I've never heard of people dreaming in all 5 senses before. Maybe we should head over to the library and check out a book on dreams." I shook my head. "No, you can go if you want to, but I have enough dream stuff on my mind without researching brain patterns or mythology." Geraldine cocked her head to the side. "Fine," she said. "Then how about we blow off some steam by skipping class and day drinking in your dorm room? I'll even bring a dime bag to share. Your roommate dropped out. Nobody's going to bother us while we have our own little party." "I have to admit that sounds like fun," I replied with a smile. "And I could definitely use something to clear these thoughts out of my head." "Great," she chirped happily. "You head home and I'll meet you there in an hour with everything." Geraldine was true to her word, and she showed an hour later, almost to the minute, with a backpack full of beer, a flask of whiskey, and a baggie of weed and rolling papers. We launched right into our private party, leading off with a couple of Boilermakers before lighting a couple of joints. Underage drinking and drug use be damned, I felt happy and free for the first time since the nightmares began. We chatted like we always do, about anything and everything that is, except my nightmares, and the distraction proved good for me. Having those dark thoughts pushed aside for a little bit of chemically enhanced normalcy was exactly the medicine I needed. After our 5th game of Uno, Geraldine happened to look at my desk and noticed the idol for the first time. "What's that?" she inquired, curiosity taking over. I walked over, picked it up, brought it to the table, and set it down in between us. "This is an antique idol of Baphomet from the 6th century, I informed her. "I picked it up at Gannon's a couple of days ago, and I'm pretty sure I got it for way less than what it's worth." Geraldine was fixated on the small idol. "May I pick it up and take a closer look?" she asked. "I've never seen anything like it." "Oh, right ahead," I replied with a wave of my hand. "Just don't drop it. I'm taking my mom out to get it appraised with me this summer. If it's worth bank, I'm selling it, and I want to get top dollar." She picked it up carefully and turned it over this way, and that as she examined it closely. "I didn't think people knew how to make such detailed sculptures back then," she replied. "The details are finer than even the greatest Greek and Roman master sculptors, and art was in decline in the 6th century. You would know that Ms. Art Major." I laughed. She looked concerned. "I'm serious," she replied gravely. "The work is too detailed to be a bronze sculpture from that time period. How do you know it's not a fake?" My jaw dropped in surprise. I never thought about that," I stammered. "I bought it at Gannon's, so I just assumed the old man wouldn't rip me off." "Did he give you any documentation we can use to validate it?" she asked. It took me a moment to remember, but when I did, I got up and went to my bookshelf. I pulled out the binder old man Gannon had given me and brought it to Geraldine. "He gave me this," I stated. "He called it Providence." Geraldine set the idol down and took the binder from me. She opened it and flipped through the pages, quickly glancing at each document, taking only long enough to note that the original showed the proper signs of age before moving on to the next page. She nodded her head approvingly. "This is good," she said brightly. "Have you read any of it yet?" I shook my head. "No. He said I should as soon as possible, but I've been too busy and tired to bother." "Mind if I borrow this then?" she asked. "I'd love to learn the history of this little demon of yours." Something about the word demon shook me slightly as the word rattled around in my brain. I dismissed it as nothing more than the jitters from 2 nights of vivid nightmares. Go right ahead, I accented. You're better qualified to validate this art stuff than I am. Great, she replied happily as she closed the binder. Now how about you put your demon back where it belongs and have a rematch? And that's what we did until the hour was late and we were both thoroughly faded. We said goodnight and Geraldine took the binder with her. My dreams that night were less intense. The hellish torments and violence were replaced with a singular vision of Baphomet seated atop a throne of bone with rivers of blood flowing out from the base. He spoke to me in a deep voice, speaking a dark language that I could not understand. With each word, I could feel a sensation in my brain like thin threads wrapping around the inside of my skull. The great demon said something I didn't understand, but the tone made it clear that it was a command. I obediently approached the throne and held out my hand. He took it in one great hand, and his grip was like a vise, though I did not resist. He closed his other hand, leaving only his index finger outstretched. Then he lowered it to my open palm and drew his long, sharp talon along it, leaving a deep, bloody gash behind. I felt the sting as his claw pierced my skin, and the slicing burn as he cut my palm open, but I did not scream. He let go of my hand and stretched his arms and wings out wide as he stared so deep into my eyes that I could swear he saw my very soul. Under some compulsion, I raised my cut and bleeding hand and pressed it against his bare chest, directly between the breasts, right over his heart. Something surged through my body, and it was both exquisitely delightful and exquisitely agonizing at the same time. It branched like lightning through every organ and limb and sat in my brain like fire. Then I woke up, my alarm blaring, telling me it was time to get up and get ready for class. I turned it off, sat up, and that's when I noticed the severe, throbbing pain in my right hand. I looked at it and screamed in horror. My hand was cut across the palm, blood oozing slowly through a fresh, partially cauterized wound, just like it was in my dream. The amount of panic I experienced at this is beyond my ability to describe. I screamed and I kept screaming until people began pounding on my door. If I hadn't stopped and answered it, they would have battered it down to rescue me from whatever had me screaming so loud and long. Several people offered to escort me to the doctor when I showed them my garish wound, but I refused. They would have asked questions, and my answers would have made me look crazy. Who would believe that I merely went to bed, dreamed about a demon cutting my palm, and woke up to a slashed hand in real life? They would think I was either crazy or having a mental breakdown. I lied and told them it was an accident, that I was only screaming in pain, and that I would go to the doctor. None of it was true. I called Geraldine, and she didn't answer her phone. I called again, and again, and again to no avail. I went to her dorm, and her roommate didn't know where she was. She didn't come to class. I was fully freaking out by the time I returned to my dorm, and was fully relieved to see Geraldine waiting at my door with the binder of Provenance and a dusty old book that looked like no one had read it in years. She didn't wait for me to acknowledge her. "We need to talk in private now," she insisted, dispensing with all of our usual pleasantries. "Okay," I said dumbly, taken aback by her alien demeanor. I unlocked my dorm, and we both entered. No sooner was the door closed than Geraldine began to speak rapidly. "We have a problem," she blurted. "A big, giant, humongous, gigantic problem." She hurried to the table without waiting for a response and put the binder and the book down on it. "Sit," she insisted. "Wait," I replied. "Whatever it is, I think we need a drink." She nodded in agreement, and I retrieved a couple of beers from the fridge, cracked them open, set them down on the table, and took my seat. Geraldine responded by picking up her beer and chugging it faster than I had ever seen her do before. She looked like she thought it might be the last beer she ever drank, and didn't want to waste a moment downing it. She slammed the empty can down on the table, belched, and tapped the binder with her free hand as she wiped her mouth on her sleeve. "I couldn't sleep last night, so I read this," she began hastily. Catching herself, she slowed down. "I couldn't sleep because I was having the same crazy nightmares you told me you've been having, and I woke up having a panic attack after just an hour of sleep. So I decided to read the documents your little statue came with." "Idol," I corrected. "It's an idol." I know that she growled testily. "Stop being pedantic and listen to me. If these documents are telling the truth, we have a big problem, and we have to find a way to fix it." I took a big drink of my beer. "I think you're right." I sighed. "I had a different dream last night, but when I woke up I had this." I showed her my right hand, and her eyes grew wide at the sight of the gash across my palm. "Oh, no," she said slowly. No. She grew more frantic with every no. "It's really happening. God help us, it's really happening." "What's happening?" I asked seriously. She looked into my eyes with a fixed, panicked stare. "Baphomet, the real Baphomet, is coming for us." I shook my head in disbelief and took another swig of beer to calm my nerves. What she said was unbelievable, but she obviously believed it, and it was enough to make me question my own firm belief that nothing supernatural is real. "That's impossible," I replied without conviction. "And even if he were coming for me, why would he come for you?" Geraldine opened the binder to spot she had bookmarked and tapped the page repeatedly with her finger. "It says here that the idol finds those whom Baphomet has chosen to be his servants. It says that he comes to them in their dreams, and after tormenting them with visions of their future, he binds them to him in an eternal blood oath." "No way," I said hesitantly, my lack of conviction apparent in every syllable and pause. "If that were true, there would be records, a lot of them." Geraldine turned her hands to point down at the binder. "There are," she insisted. "Right here. Over 100 of them. They are personal accounts and eyewitness accounts of the people who once owned your idol, and what it did to them, and those around them. It's dangerous." Old Man Gannon's words echoed in my memory. "Be sure to read it as soon as you get home," I murmured. "What?" Geraldine asked, not quite hearing me. "Old Man Gannon told me to make sure to read the binder as soon as I got home," I replied. "I didn't, and you're starting to make me think I should have." She turned the pages back to the first one, then flipped to the English translation. "Read this," she commanded, sliding the binder over to me. "Beware the idol of Baphomet," I read aloud. "This graven image is no mere trinket. It is empowered by the demon lord himself, and failure to perform the proper rituals will result in your doom." I looked up at my friend. "This is serious?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but wishing for a different one. She nodded gravely. "He goes on to give a detailed ritual that must be performed before you go to sleep any day that you touch the idol once it comes into your possession. Failure to do it opens you up to Baphomet and allows his influence to spread to others through you if you let them touch it too. They can cleanse themselves with the same ritual, but it has to be done before they go to sleep, or else he can claim them too." "Then let's do the ritual," I blurted. "Let's do it now and get it over with, and never touch that accursed thing again." Geraldine shook her head with tears welling up in her eyes. "It doesn't work that way," she said sadly. "Once he's in you, he's there to stay. This binder is filled with people's failed attempts to regain their freedom once they let Baphomet in, and nothing worked. No exorcism, no ritual, no holy trinket, nothing released them from the demon's grasp." I felt a crushing weight inside my chest as her words sunk in. I sat back in my chair, fully deflated. "So there's no hope," I said resignedly. "We're both doomed." "Maybe not," she replied with faint hope. "One of the documents mentions a book called, well, in English it's called The Tome of Dreams. I went to the library as soon as it opened hoping to find a translated copy, and I did." She held up the dusty old book triumphantly. "I spent my entire day reading it, and it mentions a way to fight back, but it has to be done inside the dream itself. But there's a catch." "And?" I inquired impatiently, not liking the theatrics. "It says that if you fail, your fate is sealed, and the totem that brought the demon upon you will seek out a new servant." "Well, that's not high stakes at all," I said sarcastically. "And what happens if we do nothing? If I just keep the idol and go about my life as best I can with completely messed up dreams?" She gave me a serious, fixed gaze that demanded and held my attention. "The same thing, only slower as he gradually hollows you out and enslaves you to his will." I felt utterly defeated. "Then I guess we have no choice. What do we do?" "Not we," she corrected. I am the most recent person touched by Baphomet's influence. I have to do it first, and if I succeed I can guide you through it, both here and in the hell world." "You mean the dream world?" I asked. "No," she said flatly. "These dreams aren't dreams. They're us, literally us, our souls, being taken to Baphomet's realm in hell. It's a hell world." It took a moment for the gravity of her revelation to properly sink in. "Well, that sucks," I groaned. Geraldine produced a thermos from wherever she had it hidden on her body. How had I not noticed it before? "Tonight, before going to bed, I'm going to drink this. It's a tea made from a blend marijuana, peyote, and ayahuasca. It's a shamanic thing with no connection to the Judeo-Christian tradition that Baphomet belongs to. It taps into the older, pagan era when he was worshipped as a dark god. I'm going to drink this, perform the ritual in the hell world itself, and free myself of this curse before helping you do the same thing." I was out of my depth. What she told me made no sense, but I could not deny the physical proof cut into my own hand. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to scream that it was all nonsense. I wanted to laugh and call it absurd. I wanted anything other than to admit the truth and face reality. The reality is that I messed up big time. As big as anyone can mess up, and not only was I paying for it, but so was my friend and classmate. And it was all my fault. It was my fault for buying the idol in the first place. It was my fault for ignoring old man Gannon when he told me the idol was not for me. It was my fault for ignoring him again and not bothering to read the binder he gave me and warned me to read. It was my fault for letting Geraldine touch the idol after these previous priest's faults. It was all mine, and I hated it, but I was impotent to do anything about it. Geraldine drank her potion and went to bed in my dorm that night. I don't know what she did, but my own dreams were peaceful at first. They were nothing more than the ordinary, meaningless drivel of a mind sorting out what it had been taking in. Then, at the end, everything shifted suddenly, and I found myself in Baphomet's throne room once again. I saw him lift Geraldine up with one clawed hand until she was left dangling over the edge of the throne. She gasped as she clawed futilely at his iron grasp. He spoke in that same strange language, his deep voice resonating throughout the room in my own body and mind. I could not understand the words themselves, but somehow I knew their meaning. Failure. Now take your place forever. Then there was great snap, and I saw Geraldine's head suddenly cope too far to one side, her mouth hanging slack, staring straight ahead with lifeless eyes. Baphomet turned his fell gaze upon me and spoke again, and I knew, somehow I knew he was promising terrible, terrible things, and I would live long enough to regret my mistake before he took me to spend eternity at his side in hell. That was 6 days ago. At least that's what the calendar on my computer is telling me right now. My body is cut up and bruised, and I hurt to my very soul. When I came to this morning, Geraldine was missing. There is only a blood stain where she had lain to go to sleep that night. The idol is missing too. Where it went, I cannot know. Honestly, I hope Geraldine somehow survived, that my dream was a lie, and she took the accursed thing to destroy, or failing that, hide it where no one will ever be cursed by its presence again. But I don't think that's what happened. My head is filled with fuzzy visions of terrible deeds seen through my own eyes, but as though I am merely an observer in my own body, like someone else was in control the whole time. I went online and searched up the strange visions in my head, and they are all real. The murder of a family of 5 2 days ago, slaughtered with such brutality that the cops are unsure if it was man or beast that did them in. The torture of a classmate out in the woods, left for dead once she was too weak from blood loss to scream anymore. A cinder block dropped from an overpass, smashing the windshield of a passing car below, causing it to careen out of control and cause a 40-car pileup with over a dozen fatalities. These visions and more, so many more, were all true. The last 6 days have been marred by murder and mayhem, and I know that I am at the center of it all. These bloodstains on my clothes are not only my own. They are the blood of my victims, too many victims, and the memory of the atrocities I committed are coming back like a crashing wave. The dreamlike fog I first saw them in, the faint wisp of a memory that first set to my task of researching them, has been blown away. I know what I did. I know my crimes. I know that I was not in control of my own body as I committed them. And I know that I liked them. God help me, I liked them. I know I should turn myself in. I know I need to go to the police, confess, and have them throw in solitary confinement before I fall asleep again. But I can't. I won't. My will is no longer my own. My will, my body, and my soul belong to Baphomet. I am his to do with as he pleases. 6 days a week I am bound to labor for him. One day only, the Lord's day, I am free to do as I will. Even if I wanted to, I don't know if I could turn myself in. I don't know if Baphomet would exert his will or influence to stop me. I am bound to him now. By blood I am bound, and nothing can change that now. What I can do is tell my story. I can warn you that if you find the idol of Baphomet, do not take possession of it. I don't even touch it. The binder with the protection ritual is gone now. Destroying it was the first thing I did when my master took over my body. Without it, you are as helpless to resist him as I was. I know what I should do. I know I should go to the police. I know I should end myself if I don't imprison myself. It's the right thing to do, but the truth is, all I want to do is go to sleep and let my master take control for the next 6 days. I just hope he doesn't follow through on his threat and take me home. I know his intentions for my family, and I have seen his handiwork firsthand.